Good afternoon and welcome back to Falling Walls Conversations. I'm Charlotte Stoddart. I'm a science filmmaker and podcaster, making content for Nature and for other science magazines. And today I'm the moderator for this conversation with Mark Ferguson, who we'll meet in just a moment. First, some technical notes for anyone who's new to this conversation. We have 25 minutes and we're encouraging you in the digital audience to ask questions and join the conversation. So if you have a question at any point, you can signal that by clicking on the raise hand button in Zoom, and then you'll be spotlighted, which means that it's your turn to ask the next question, and then I'll let you know when it's time to talk. If you have a follow-up question, you can click on the raise hand button again. If you have technical difficulties, you can let us know in the chat section, and one of our team will try to help you. This conversation is being recorded and will be available online after the Falling Walls Science Summit. Okay, let's meet Mark Ferguson. Hello, Mark.
Hello.
Mark is Director General of Science Foundation Ireland, which supports science and technology research with funding, and also supports science education in Ireland, of course. He's also a scientific advisor to the government of Ireland, and in that role, you played a part in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes.
Also, as a scientist in a previous career, Mark worked on mechanisms of wound healing, and I read that you also looked at sex determination in crocodiles.
That's right.
But first, let's talk about the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm interested in what lessons you've learned from being part of that, and whether those are lessons that we could apply to other big challenges, perhaps like climate change.
So absolutely. So I think there are a couple of lessons out of the COVID crisis. I mean, first of all, I think we were able to move at speed, and I think we were able to move at speed with no loss of quality. So that's a big, important lesson. Secondly, I think the scientists collaborated very well. There was sharing of the genomic sequence, there was sharing of technology and knowledge and so on, and the vaccines were developed in super fast time. Probably we could have done a better job in international collaboration, for example, on clinical trials. It was very slow to coordinate. We could probably have done a better job on implementation of some of the aspects. So there's stuff to learn there. There's stuff, good news, and there's also stuff to learn. And I think the other interesting thing is the immediacy of the problem. And many problems like obesity and like climate change, they're slow burners. They don't quite have that immediate urgency. And somehow we need to inject some of that in order to be able to address those crises.
How do you think we can do that then? How can we make people feel the urgency of, for example, climate change?
I think that's already happening. I mean, people are seeing, for example, the effects of devastating flood or drought. They're seeing it in their own countries. And I think that will have a galvanizing effect. And I think there's quite a lot to build on there. And I think the other thing is we really need to have another agenda other than doom and gloom about climate. So there's a lot of doom and gloom, and that's appropriate because, you know, if we don't do certain things. But there's also huge opportunity. I mean, there's opportunities to create new businesses. There's opportunities to find uses for carbon dioxide as a substrate, for carbon capture and storage, for using natural solutions. So this is also a time of huge opportunity, both for science and also for entrepreneurship, forming new businesses that could grow and scale into huge corporations. And I mean, what could be better than making money, employing people, and doing good for the planet? I mean, that's cool.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, we really don't hear much of a positive spin when it comes to climate challenges.
Yep.
And why do you think that is, actually? Because that sounds like an excellent way to encourage people to take on climate challenges.
Well, I think that, you know, we need to portray that this is a really interesting area of science and of innovation. For example, there are published papers that show you make a few genetic changes in a bacteria, and it uses CO2 as a substrate instead of sugar. Now, there's never been a pressing need to replace sugar as a substrate for growing, But if you can replace it with CO2, and then you can be paid for taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and you can be doing good at the same time, that's a wonderful opportunity. So I think, you know, just pointing out that the science and the innovation in these areas, I believe will lead to really disruptive new large industries. And that's a big opportunity. And it's a big opportunity to help save the planet, but it's also a big opportunity for new economies. It's not all doom and gloom. And so we need to balance, you know, the kind of warnings, which are appropriate, I'm not against them, with the opportunities, and inspire people who really want to do things like that.
It's a shame you're not in Glasgow at COP26, where I feel like they could do with a little bit more of this positivity. I'd like to ask you about Ireland and what it's like, or maybe the differences between supporting research and innovation in a small country like Ireland compared with, say, Germany or the US, for example.
So small countries are not scaled down versions of large countries. You know, you can't do everything well. So making choices is very important. Asking the question, you know, why Ireland? Why would we do that particular thing in Ireland? And being absolutely world-class. So, you know, science and innovation is a world-class entity. It's not any good to be the best in Ireland. You've got to be the best in the world. So I think in small countries, making choices becomes very important. Prioritization becomes important. In our case, asking the question why Ireland becomes very important. Working with other people, collaboration. We're big fans of the European Union. So, you know, it's really important that, that we participate in those, because there's infrastructure, for example, that we could never build, and it would not be sensible for us to build as a small country. So looking to collaborate with others, looking to see how we can leverage those collective strengths, but also being in a leadership position, you know, encouraging people, just because you come from a small country doesn't mean you can't be amongst the best in the world. And then the last thing I would say is that small countries like Ireland, we have distributed excellence. So what do I mean by that? You won't find a university that looks like Harvard or Yale or Oxford or Cambridge, where there are excellent people in every discipline in the same university. But you will find excellent people in a discipline, both in academia and industry, throughout the country. And so finding this way of networking those people in a small country is really important. It's a distributed excellence program. And just because you're small doesn't mean it's all bad. Like, we can be more agile. So the upside is there's a short distance between, you know, the decision makers and the people doing, and we need to leverage that. We need to be agile, we need to be fast moving, and that's important.
You spoke about choices and how important it is to prioritise in a smaller country. What choices are you making in Ireland, and what are your priorities at the moment? So,
I mean, first of all, there's always a baseline level of support for everything. So let me say that up front. But then you have to ask the question, what are important emerging areas? So you would look to see what is it from the natural history or geography of Ireland. So agriculture is clearly important. We have large deposits of zinc, that's important. Then look at the industries that are there. We have the European headquarters of most of the major IT and pharma industries. So the Facebooks, the LinkedIns, and the Googles and the Microsofts. That's important because they employ thousands and thousands of people. Pharmaceutical manufacturing, also very important. Then thinking about new areas that we could take leadership in. For example, the green economy that I talked about before, renewable energy. At the moment, Ireland imports nearly all of its energy through oil and gas. By 2050 for sure, maybe 2030, we will be exporting renewable energy. We'll have an excess of it from wind, both on land and offshore. So those are become some of the interesting things. And then having an eye on stuff that everybody's doing, artificial intelligence, quantum, all that kind of stuff. But really asking the question, why Ireland, I think becomes quite an interesting one. And the sustainability and green agenda plays well to our credentials. After all, we are a green country. I'm wearing a green tie.
Before we continue, we'll just check if there are any questions from the audience, and just remind people that you can click on the raise hand function in Zoom if you'd like to ask a question. Okay. I wanted to ask you about the European Innovation Council, yes, because I understand you've been involved in the sort of setup of this new institution. So I wonder if you could tell us what it is and why it was needed.
Very good. So I'm privileged to chair the board of the European Innovation Council, and this is a new instrument under the third pillar of Horizon Europe, the innovation pillar. And this is really about addressing the challenge in Europe, which is about scaling deep tech businesses. So if you look at Europe compared to, for example, the United States, then we're pretty good at the science. It's pretty much on the same par as measured by citations. We're actually pretty good at startup companies. What we're not good at is scaling those companies into new businesses. So the European Innovation Council is addressing that, and it's addressing it in a couple of ways. The first is a so-called accelerator program, and that's really about being able to provide a grant and equity investment for emerging new companies. So you can get up to 2.5 million in a grant and up to 15 million in equity investment. It's about crowding in the private sector, so we really want to work with people. You know, the sweet spot is somebody's got a great new deep tech invention, it's probably got a bit of risk sitting around it, and maybe some private investors are willing to put in, say, 10 million, but the company needs 20 million, and the European disease is to sort of say, try and make do with 10, you know, and in America that wouldn't happen. So we're there to kind of co-fund, to de-risk for people, and to really allow businesses to scale rapidly, and frankly to fail rapidly as well. Not everything works the way you expect it to, and so there's a big difference between taking a stupid risk and a high risk, and we are in the business of taking high risks, not in the business of taking stupid risks. So this is about really trying to provide an opportunity for entrepreneurs. And then the other part of it is the PATH program, and that's really about a European DARPA. That's about top-down, looking at how we can identify some technologies and really bring groups together and manage those actively with a program manager. And then finally, the third program is transition, what it says on the tin, transitioning from a scientific idea into a business. So 3 simple programs, a lot of corporate mentorship, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of applications, very competitive, and that's what we really want to do. We want to scale new deep tech businesses in Europe, and I think that's really needed. And we really want to work with the private sector, with national funders. It's about crowding in. Crowding in is a really important thing. And nothing would please me more than we crowd in so many people that we're not needed. That'd be terrific.
That sounds exciting. What stage is it at the moment? Are you just sifting through applications, or have you got some companies that have already sort of started? Working with?
We've already started. So there was a couple of years of pilot. So the pilot was building as well as doing a pilot. So that was very challenging. And we've gone through the first round of funding, averaging about 4,000 or 5,000 applications per round. The target, which was met, is 6 months from application to money in the bank. So this is a fast process. It's a very rigorous process. So you apply. Initially, you load up a YouTube video and you give 3 minutes presentation. Then you have a form to fill in, an application, then you have an interview. It's like a business plan, you write. Then you have an interview with a jury and put through your paces, and then a decision is made. So being market-facing, you know, in timeline, in rigor, and in crowding in. And so there are hundreds of companies, actually about 200, I think 186 is the last number I saw, investments to date, and more to come. So this is about working with people. So this is about crowding in from the private sector, from national funders and so on. And it's really trying to scale deep tech businesses. What's very pleasing is that several of those businesses that have been had a couple of years investment are now worth more than 100 million. They may have worth nothing 2 or 3 years ago. So we're looking for unicorns, we're looking for success, and equally, of course, there are businesses that didn't work the way that they were expected to, and that's fine too. I mean, not everything works the way you expect it to, and that's a very important lesson. But, you know, at pace, failing fast, failing cheaply, if it's going, scaling quickly and scaling well, that's the name of the game.
Could you give us a couple of examples of the kind of deep tech businesses that you've been supporting and what you mean by deep tech?
So by deep tech, I mean anything from IT, artificial intelligence, app development, I mean pharma, biotech, so anything that basically has a scientific principle. So we're not funding butcher shops or bakeries or things like that. It's a deep tech, but it's always bottom up. So we're always saying we're open to all areas. We may add to that a specific initiative, let's say like the Green New Deal or a biotech. So for example, within a couple of months, we launched a call for the coronavirus crisis. And from that have developed a whole series of things, a whole series of instrumentations, for example, robots with UV that can move around and sterilize awkward areas, for example, in hospitals. So you can imagine, you know, X-ray equipment, or it's quite difficult to sterilize, but not with UV and not with a robot, and not doing it, you know, at 3 o'clock in the morning with an automated sensor. So those are interesting things. The same sort of thing in drug development and how you develop either drugs or pharmaceuticals or vaccines. And then on the IT space, you know, people looking at, for example, electric vehicles, people looking at new ways of using disruptive IT for whatever digital solution, agri-tech, you know, looking at the agricultural industry. So a whole range of topics, really important and really important to be addressed. The success rate is quite low because there's a lot of applications, and even though we've got more than 10 billion, but we also have a seal of excellence. So if you are judged to be worthy of funding but haven't made it high enough up the priority list, we award a seal of excellence. And that means that the country can use the structural funds to invest in that company if the country chooses without breaching state aid rules. This is very important, particularly for the newer countries who are parts of the EU, where they have very good structural funds and where often there are excellent projects that don't quite make it up there. My interpretation is that they don't always have the support structures that there may be, say, in Ireland or Germany or France. So this is a terrific way of leveling up, bringing everybody up. So, so that's what we do.
It sounds like speed is quite key in this process, and that must have been true when it came to the pandemic and the UV robots, for example. Yep. Have they gone from idea to actually being in hospitals since the beginning of the pandemic? Yes,
they've gone from an idea to a prototype, to then 100 prototypes, and now scaling up to manufacture even more. So speed is important, and speed is not incompatible with quality. You know, you need quality, you need rigor, but that's not an excuse for not doing things as quickly as you can. So that's really important, and that's important in the business world. It's important in the innovation world. You know, being first is actually quite important.
Absolutely. I read that in one of your roles, you reviewed the research and innovation systems in several countries. I think Denmark, Hungary, and Canada are on that list.
Yes.
And I'm curious to know what you found and who's doing it well.
So I think, you know, I always define leadership as being able to look around the world and pick up ideas that other people have very quickly and implement them. But equally to be able to think of something that nobody else has done so that they look at that and say, oh gosh, we should do that. So I think that's a really important principle. I think it's really important for everybody to be looking and thinking, oh, that's interesting, didn't think about that, you know, we could think about implementing something there. And then it's equally important for us to innovate. And if you think about it, you know, science is all about discovering new things and innovation, but the scientists can be very conservative about how they administer science. It's like, you know, there's an application and you peer review it and it takes 6 months or a year. It doesn't have to be that way. And so we should do experiments, and I'm very keen that we do experiments. And so, for example, the Canadians had really questioned the value of peer review. And if you think about it, you know, we are very fond of saying that any policy should be based on evidence, but look for the evidence that peer review works, and there are very few tests of it. So it's a bit like democracy. Of course it's a good thing, and of course I support it, but are there alternative ways of doing it, you know, and are there issues that sit with it? So they did some quite interesting things there. You know, the Volkswagen Foundation here are looking at whether or not there's any difference in the outcome between a series of grants that you fund through peer review and others that you just fund randomly after some kind of technical check. So I think, you know, we need to think innovatively out of the box sometimes, and getting ideas and doing experiments and being willing to say, actually, we tried that and it didn't work, or we tried that and it was a big success, as well as doing the things conventionally. So those are some of the things that you would get.
peer review is such a sort of integral part of the scientific process at the moment. Sounds like even with some evidence that maybe that system isn't working as well as we'd hoped, that would be a difficult thing to change.
It would be, but I mean, if you look at, so I'm a fan of peer review, don't get me wrong, but where does peer review not work very well? It doesn't work very well in interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary subjects. So peer review is actually very conservative. You know, if you read reviews, and it comes through the agency all the time, you know, they tend to be quite conservative. If you're outside the mainstream, you know, people can be quite critical. And so a typical damning review would be, Professor X is brilliant as a physicist, but I'm not sure about their role in climate change. Okay, like that's a damning statement. It's probably true, but it's a damning statement in peer review. So we need to find ways of supplementing that. I mean, one of the experiments we've done is that we've said we will use peer review for our big projects. This is where we're deploying a lot of money to determine what is fundable, but we will not use peer review to determine the priority list that's on the funding. So when you look at the analysis of peer review, it's very good at telling you what you should fund and what you shouldn't fund, but there's no correlation between the priority order as listed in peer review and the subsequent outcome. So what we've done there is we said we look at the potential impact, and we look at this in different ways. What way could it be used by society, by industry, and so on? And we'll rank the fundable projects that way. And that makes, and so interdisciplinarity scores badly in peer review, but it gets a lot of points on their impact. You actually, if you want to address climate change, you need social scientists, you need different domains of science collaborating. So I think we need to be just clever about how we look at the advantages of some systems and the inherent disadvantages which are there, and how you might balance some of those things out. And that's just an example of how you might do that.
Before we finish, I want to ask you just quickly about the transition that you made from being a scientist to being in these leadership roles, thinking much more broadly about science. Was that a difficult transition to make?
No, I mean, I'm one of I consider myself very lucky. I have always thought I had the best job in the world. So any job I ever had, so when I was a postdoc, when I was a lecturer, when I was a professor, I thought it was great. When I was a dean, I thought it was great. When I was an entrepreneur and founder of a company, I thought it was great. And I find it great being in government. So I think it's really important that you have that mindset. It's really important that you value lots of different contributions. So, you know, working at the bench is really important, but actually how you organize structures is very important as well. How you influence policy is very important, looking at new things. Entrepreneurship, I think, is really important. Like, it is a super rewarding thing to discover something new, think about how it can be applied, and then create a business that employs people, that gets very dedicated people focusing on trying to develop this further forward. It's always high risk. It's probably even more high risk than being a scientist, because you typically have a year or two's money in the bank. So all of those things, I think, are important. And it's really important, in my view, to tell people that there isn't any hierarchy. There's a lot of people who believe that if you haven't become a professor, you've failed, okay? I don't share that view at all. I think it's equally good to be a professor. It's equally good to work in industry. It's equally good to go into policy. It's equally good to go into the civil service. You just need to be flipping good at what you do. And if you're good at what you do and you're passionate about what you do and you enjoy what you do, you can make a big contribution. So, and variety is great. Like, I describe myself as a mutant in the system. And a mutant in the system is a really important analogy, because for a mutation to be successful, you've got to be compatible with the system, but you've also got to bring something new. So there's no good in being so disruptive that people just dismiss you. You need to be able to work with the system, but you also need to be able to influence change. And that's common to all of the things that we do. So my message to all the young people is, you can be anything. You can be anything you want.
And on that optimistic note, Mark, we need to end our conversation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been really interesting. We'll take a 5-minute break now. If you'd like to stay on the Zoom call, then you can join our next conversation, which will begin in 5 minutes.